Hello there, guppies. So today we're going to talk about Unit 6. So this is estuaries, wetlands, and beaches. So this is like North Carolina coast focused. Um, and so we just finished all the animals, and now we're kind of talking about like more local environments. And then we'll talk about tropical communities like coral reefs and mangroves. And then we'll finish out this kind of 6 through 8 unit with deep ocean, and then we'll finish the class with human impacts. All right, so estuaries, the definition of an estuary is a partially enclosed coastal embayment where freshwater flowing from rivers meets the saltwater from the ocean. So we've got, this is specifically our coastal embayment, semi-enclosed estuary. And we've got the Pamlico Sound and the Albemarle Sound, and they are partial freshwater, partial saltwater. So it can be a range of salinity all throughout our estuary. And then these different colors here are just marking the different river basins where the water comes from that flows out into the sounds. We have 2.2 million acres of estuarine habitat in North Carolina. And this is a really great thing to have in North Carolina because there are such good nursery habitats for small fishes and shrimp. They start their lives out here, and lots of them migrate out into the ocean. Dolphins, sharks, sea turtles can all use them as refuges, as little protection areas where the really strong currents and the really big predators aren't around. So they can use it for refuge, for feeding in a nutrient-rich area because all the nutrients are coming from coming from the rivers. And then it washes down into the estuaries, and you have a very nutrient-rich, shallow, lots of phytoplankton, making food. So it's a really, really good, safe place. Little like kiddie pool, if you will, for the young animals of the ocean. All right, there are 4 different types, and you'll need to know the examples of these. So please make a note of which ones are which. We have a semi-enclosed bay or a lagoon, is kind of what it's called. We have a partially enclosed embayment or bay. The most common one, though, is that one like the Chesapeake, which is a coastal plain estuary, which is this picture actually right here. You can see it just goes into the coastline and kind of makes a coastal plain estuary. It's where there was ice formed the last ice age, and when after that ice receded, we had sea level rise, and those areas used to be land, but because the sea level rose, the low-lying coastal areas, rivers and valleys, became these coastal plains. Okay, so that's the most common, and the Chesapeake is the most common one you should know. Tectonic estuary is the next type, and why is that spelled incorrectly? Oh, because it's reinvade. It reinvades the area. Don't like that though. Okay, sorry. I'm gonna stop messing with that. This is when the sea reinvades the area due to substance of the land. So as the land sinks down, water can come into that area and becomes a mix. And so if you've ever seen the San Francisco Bay, it's like a little scoop within the kind of, it's like a scoop within the outside of California. I'll show you a picture in class. But this is the part of where the substance of the land, because of the tectonic plates and how they're moving, especially in that area, they're coming together right there, kind of sliding past each other. And so there's some moving towards and sliding past, and it's creating a substance or a sinking of the land, which is where the water is flooding in, and it becomes a mixture of both salt and fresh water. Like I said, we have a semi-closed bay, and then fjords are the last one. Yes, it's not a fjord, it's a fjord is how it's pronounced. And these usually used to be glacial valleys that there was a ton of ice in. That's this picture right here. And once that ice receded, then it's been invaded by the sea. And so now we've got a mixture of both. And then this picture up at the top is actually North Carolina, which is a semi-enclosed bay. So the only picture you don't see here is a tectonic estuary. All right, some threats that our estuaries face is runoff. The biggest one is runoff. So obviously runoff is just when water doesn't soak into the land and it begins to flow over the land because it can't be soaked into the land. But the problem with runoff isn't that there's runoff. The problem is that runoff picks up a lot of chemicals like fertilizers, oils, sewage, medical waste, et cetera, and all those things that flow down as the water passes over it, floods into the Tar River, the Neuse River, the Haw River, the Cape Fear River. Eventually, they make their way out to the ocean, and the Pamlico Sound is kind of a protected area by those our specific little barrier islands. And because of that, we have a large level of chemicals and pollutants that can build up in this area. We know that it can cause algae blooms, which are not beneficial. We know that that can cause toxins to bioaccumulate up the food chain via shellfish or other things like phytoplankton that get the fertilizers first, and then it builds as it goes up the food chain. If you did not know this, now you will. Most of Wake County dumps into the Neuse River. Southwest Wake County is more dumps into Cape Fear River. So we dump into the Neuse River because Southwest Wake County is farther down. So if you live anywhere south of here, it's probably going to dump into the Cape Fear River. But our school dumps into the Neuse River. And then that Neuse River makes its way, as you can see right here, all the way out to the Pamlico Sound. So whatever things come off of your car, random fertilizers you over-fertilize your grass with, whatever it is, will eventually flow down into the Pamlico Sound and possibly harm fishes and other marine life. I would argue that runoff is one of the largest pollutants, is the largest pollutant in the ocean. While plastics are a problem, runoff is the major source. So any of those chemicals that can flow can cause a nutrient issue. Remember when we talked about DDTs and PCBs? Remember from the orca, swimming with orca video, those are also other toxins that can be an issue. And remember, in the orca, it caused an issue with their ability to breed, their ability to produce offsprings, which will eventually hurt the overall population. So this could be really bad, and we do actually make a big impact on the ocean and on the coastline. All right, some characteristics of estuaries. There's a couple of these. So these are submerged aquatic vegetation. They have a lot of them within the estuary environment. And they basically are an underwater garden for lots of different invertebrates. So seagrasses are a big one of those. Seagrasses are a really good gauge of how clear the water is or how good the water is, because if it's clear, then seagrasses can grow. If it's turbid and it's very, thick with sediments and other pollution, you're not going to have seagrasses growing. So seagrasses tell us that the water is healthy. They are a nursery. They can produce a good amount of photosynthesis. But they're not going to filter any bad substances. They grow when it's clear, but they don't actually clean the water or anything like that. I mean, a little bit, but not as good as wetlands and other things that we'll talk about later. So some other characteristics, they have soft bottoms usually. So mudflats, beaches, shoals, sandbars, so sandy, very small sediments, which makes it soft, not a hard bottom. And this is really important because it can hold nutrients and chemicals and sediments, and it helps the cycling of nutrients throughout the ecosystem. So it helps, sequester carbon. That's a big word, but it basically locks carbon in So estuaries are important to lock down some of that carbon so it's not in the atmosphere. Algae and zooplankton live in that bottom area, and they become a food for fishes. And they also are able to hide there. Other organisms and things like that can hide there, which can make it for a good ecosystem. And lastly, one of the biggest filterers that is actually a big fishery for us is oysters. They're one of the most common types of oyster fishery, or they're one of the most common fisheries we have. And they're the most common like shelled bottom bivalves that we produce. They are really good filters of the water, and they help our underwater vegetation flourish. So the oysters actually like to live in these softer bottom areas. And so these oyster beds make for really good water filtering. So we need the soft bottoms so that we can have oysters so they can clean the water. It's like we need this so we can have this, we can have this. Some other characteristics is salinity, temperature, turbidity can vary greatly within the estuary. Wherever you are, it can be entirely different. So whether the cloudiness, the temperature, and the amount of salt can all vary as you go up and down this way and up and down this way within the estuary, both vertically and horizontally, and it can change. And this can affect the organisms that live there. They have to be very good at adapting to these changes, or they have to be good about moving throughout the estuary so they're where they need it. They're in their sweet spot, kind of like, Goldilocks and the bears. It will move to be where it needs to be. And then the most common, the water column, not most common, the water column in the estuary could be very shallow, and it could be very deep. So it very drastically is affected by tides. And it also is affected by the barrier islands. They're on the edges of the mainland. They could not exist the way that they do in this specific area without the protection of the barrier islands. So like this type of estuary is very different than a coastal plain or tectonic because of our barrier islands and how they protect the estuary. The largest fisheries in North Carolina are blue crab, shrimp, and flounder. They make up the top three. The biggest is blue crab. And estuaries are a critical environment for producing good populations of these animals. Without them, we would not have the fisheries that we do. So it's important to make sure, if you like consuming these things, to make sure that the runoff that you dump or let be run off in this area is eco-friendly. So if you need to make switch to places that are going to be eco-friendly places, be mindful of the chemical pollutants that you allow into the water system or even onto the ground, because it's going to rain, runoff. But how can you make improvements? How can you vote to make improvements in this area so that these creatures can keep pollutants out of them, so when you eat them or when other animals that you like to eat them, don't end up getting chemicals inside of you that you don't want. All right, the next coastal area is a wetland. So this is different than an estuary. Wetlands and estuaries are different. Wetlands are swamps, marshes, and bogs. They play a vital role in recycling organic waste in and out of the ecosystem. They're good nurseries, just like estuaries, but they can filter pollutants, while estuaries don't normally filter pollutants. 7% of our coastline is wetland, and so we need these areas, and it's hard to keep them because people like to live where there are wetlands. But the problem with that is that wetlands, they aren't always wet, but they're like sponges, and they're going to soak up all the water and are going to prevent flooding in areas. But when you build on wetlands, you get a problem of, now we're going to have flooding here because where there used to be a sponge, now there's a concrete layer over it and the water can no longer go there. So you have to be really careful about building on wetlands. One, because it takes away habitats, but two, you get the issue of flooding. All right, specifically North Carolina's beaches. So the northern half, the Outer Banks, and then there's the southern half, which is like south of the Outer Banks. Like you get Wilmington and Oak Island, Emerald Island, like all of those, or Emerald Isle, and all those other ones. Those are south, on the south half of North Carolina, and they each get hit by a different current, which is really interesting and makes our beaches really dynamic. So the Labrador current is the one coming from the north. We know that already from Unit 2. And that northern current is going to bring cold water and actually create a coarser, rougher sand from that cooler water. And then from the south, we're going to get the Gulf Stream, which brings warmer water, calmer waters, and finer sand. The finer sand, is created by those parrotfish that bite up the coral reefs, because coral reefs are down south, so they bring up those very fine particles up with them. So North Carolina has very dynamic, different beaches based on where you go in North Carolina. All of North Carolina's beaches are littered with sand dunes. So in the picture, you can see there's two really big sand dunes here.
Good afternoon, Athens staff. Just to let you know that we are ready for our celebration a little bit early. So if you want to come on to the cafeteria and we can start getting food and getting ready for our celebration of the 22-23 school year. Thank you very much. Take care.
Sorry about that interruption by Mr. Bears. Anyway, so you can see there we have these sand dunes that keep the sand in place, but they also protect the places beyond the beach from flooding and things like that. They have deep roots of sea oats in them, and they actually are a good they're a good environment for a lot of different creatures that can live in there. Sometimes you see turtles, and I get a lot of texts from my in-laws. Is this a sea turtle? And I'm like, no, it's not a sea turtle. They are just regular turtles, but they enjoy that area. And you can tell based on their flippers, like we've seen in pictures, like some of them have flippers, some of them have feet. They have feet, they're not sea turtles. Anyway, the general anatomy of North Carolina beaches goes dunes, open beach, intertidal area. And that length of beach is really dependent on whether it's summer or spring, and dependent on, the sand levels at those areas. Okay, I want to focus in shortly on, or briefly on, our barrier islands. So our barrier islands are home to 325 miles of sandy barrier islands. So these are made out of a medium that can move with water. And so because of that, barrier islands are geographically young. They provide protection and they're really important, but they're young because the sand is shifting constantly. They're dynamic, they're changing, they're never the same. And because of the shifting sand, we're going to have the movement of these barrier islands and the replacement of certain areas constantly throughout, years and years and years. The problem is when people try to build on them, they can have erosion happening around their homes and they get an issue. So North Carolina's actually had to spend over $700 million on beach renourishment areas projects, because we want to keep these beautiful destination homes that we have and businesses and hotels and shopping areas. But the problem is these areas are made to move. Like, they move on purpose to protect the inland. But these longshore currents that run parallel to the shoreline actually move the sand as you go down. So you can kind of see here, there's areas that have more sand and less sand. So less sand up here, more down here, because it's being pushed down. And lastly, you can see here in the longshore current that it moves parallel to the coastline, but as it moves in with the waves, it's going to slowly pull the sand as it retreats on an angle back down with, or back up, depending on which direction, along the beach line. This way is going left to right, but it's pulling the sand. And then also you can see a picture here how barrier islands actually are supposed to be demolished so that the water can escape and not be trapped inland so that flooding from things like Hurricane Irene or other hurricanes can actually get their water out into the ocean as opposed to staying in the land and threatening the areas and ecosystems there. Okay, so that kind of concludes coastal North Carolina, coastal lands, and kind of our intertidal areas. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.